famous phrase from the 70s from the Secretary of Agriculture was, farmers have to get big or get out. If you can't get big enough, you got to get out of farming. That's been the mantra pretty much ever since. And that's kind of the mantra that we're, in a way, exporting to developing countries, much to the detriment of those societies, of those cultures, of those food systems, and to the detriment of the food security of those people, including the farmers.
Greetings, I'm Yvonne, staff for Science for the Public, and I welcome you to our Contemporary Science Issues and Innovations program presented today as a GBH Forum Network webinar. Industrial agriculture, or Big Ag, is a major contributor to global warming, environmental destruction, and disruption of good farming practices. Our guest, researcher and author Timothy Wise, explains how industrial agriculture is more a threat to the planet and humanity than a solution to hunger. Among his multiple titles, Tim Wise is a senior advisor at the Institute for Agriculture and Trade Policy, known as IATP, and a senior research fellow at Tufts University's Global Development and Environment Institute. Today, based on his book, Eating Tomorrow, Agribusiness, Family Farmers, and the Battle for the Future of Food, as well as a couple of his recent articles, Tim Wise will step us through the problems associated with corporate agriculture, including the issue of genetically modified seeds, the toxins, and the excess fertilizers. He will also describe farming strategies that can feed the planet and help to restore global environment, economies, and health. We are very pleased to welcome him today. Thank you, Tim Wise, for joining us.
Yeah, it's a real pleasure to be here. Thank you for the invitation.
Great, and we're really looking forward to your expertise here. And to start us off, would you explain, please, industrial agriculture, Big Ag, and its characteristics and how we got there?
Yeah, I mean, the people probably have a lot of associations with Big Ag. I mean, we hear in the United States about the agribusiness lobby. We hear about we see images of giant farms and huge combines harvesting the crops from those farms. That is what industrial agriculture is. It is not the predominant form of agriculture around in the developing world and in a lot of parts of the world. And so there's a tendency in the United States for Big Ag to be, for people to either assume that that is agriculture, that's the way things need to be grown, or to harken back to very iconic images of small family farms with the red barn and those still exist in the United States, but the way we produce our food and our non-food agricultural commodities is very much in the industrial model. That model involves vast tracts of single crops in rows that can be harvested by machines that do the planting, the harvesting, the fertilizing, the spreading of herbicides to kill weeds, and the use of agricultural chemicals to nourish the plants and to kill weeds. And all of those technologies developed over the years were developed in order to take advantage in the United States of vast tracts of flat farmland that were relatively fertile and that could be farmed by machine in larger and larger quantities. And over the years, those farms have gotten larger and larger. Smaller farms haven't been able to compete. And the famous phrase from the 70s from the Secretary of Agriculture was, farmers have to get big or get out. If you can't get big enough, you got to get out of farming. That's been the mantra pretty much ever since. And that's kind of the mantra that we're, in a way, exporting to developing countries, much to the detriment of those societies, of those cultures, of those food systems, and to the detriment of the food security of those people, including the farmers who continue to grow the food that generally sustains those countries.
Tell us a little, if you will, about you mentioned these huge monoculture things, is acres and acres that go on and on forever with just one crop, one predominantly. I think corn is a big one in this country, soy, maybe another, but in any case, there are environmental impacts as well, I believe, and also biodiversity impacts, I think. Could you tell us about some of those environmental and biodiversity impacts?
Sure. The evolution of industrial agriculture really involved the substitution of capital for labor in the form, as economists would describe it, that is machinery and chemical inputs, substituting for horses, horse-drawn, for steers pulling plows. For the farm used to be a very diverse place, and the image that people have of the idyllic family farm really was a pretty diverse place. They would rotate their crops. It wasn't always corn on the same land. They would grow a variety of crops, not just corn and soybeans. They would have animals on the farm, and those animals the manure from those animals would nourish the soil. What was being grown on the farm would be feed for the animals themselves. That was a way of adding value for the small scale farmer to his or her product. So you can sell pork instead of selling just raw corn and soybeans. You get more value. That was a fairly productive model and not so destructive to the environment. But as soon as you take the animals off the farm and put them in confinements in factory farms so that you're producing them at an industrial scale as well, mass producing meat and dairy. As soon as you take the horses off the farm, you don't need oats to feed the horses, and the oats turned out to be great for the soil. You don't grow oats anymore. Then you're down to corn and soybeans. You grow them in rotation. Soybeans restore a little bit of the nitrogen depleted by the corn, but all in all, the levels of soil erosion, the levels of fertility, you need more and more fertilizer to give the plants the nutrients that they need, which does really nothing to restore the fertility of the soil. It just gives the plants the nutrients they need to grow soybeans and corn. And so over time, the fertility of the soil declines, the topsoil washes off, the chemical pollution that comes from the over application of fertilizers, herbicides, and others creates huge water problems, water pollution problems. The famous dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico is the result of agricultural chemicals washing into the streams that flow into the Mississippi and down the Mississippi and into the Gulf of Mexico. And the phosphorus and nitrates are so powerful that they basically create an oxygen-free zone that in some years in the Gulf of Mexico where the Mississippi dumps its water into the Gulf can be as large as the state of New Jersey, and nothing survives in that water. So the water pollution also pollutes wells. It pollutes drinking water. Des Moines, Iowa has the largest denitrification plant in the world because of all the agricultural runoff that's flowing in, and they depend on that water to give it to the people of Des Moines. So the environmental impacts are severe.
Yes, thank you for that. And I'd like to ask, follow up with another thing here is that you mentioned Iowa. Iowa, I think, is a leading state, maybe Idaho and Iowa, for cancer related to these huge crops. And I think glyphosate, the use of Roundup in particular, is that the case? How does that work? These things you mentioned that you have to do this enormous amount of fertilizing all the time, and I heard that they say that the soil becomes like a drug addict, more nitrogen, and it's ruined in the meantime. Now, the other aspect is they need to spray these plants, and that is highly toxic, and they keep getting away with it. Can you explain that? The use of these herbicides, insecticides, what is that about?
Yeah, I mean, plants always have pests that are trying to attack them, and farmers are always trying to control the pests. In developing countries where I saw a lot of small, diverse farms, the main way they control the pests is through the diversity of the farm. In other words, when you massively spray herbicides and pesticides on your land, you're killing a lot of things, including what are called beneficial predators. So the natural predators of the pests that are eating your corn are also killed. And so then what you're left with is the problem of a corn borer who's coming for your crop, and you've killed all the natural predators that were keeping it under control, or at least under some level of control. And you need to rely more and more on these toxic chemicals. Toxic chemicals themselves, and really not just Roundup, not just glyphosate, but a whole series of them are very, I'll say, lightly regulated in the United States. And so it's coming out more and more that there has not been adequate testing, not been adequate safety measures taken and precautions to ensure that we're not getting poisoned or other animals aren't being poisoned by the use of these chemicals. I mean, glyphosate is in the news a lot because of the jury verdicts against Monsanto and now its parent company Bayer, which I think at last count Bayer had set aside $17 billion to settle lawsuits from more than 100,000 people just in the United States who have gotten non-Hodgkin's lymphoma or other cancers from exposure to glyphosate. Right. More and more new research is coming out all the time, because it really wasn't, it should have been done before these products were released so that we knew they were safe. They're being done, the research is being done now, the evidence is coming in. And I mean, the bad news is we're in for a whole raft of bad news about the kinds of things we've allowed ourselves to be exposed to, and that our regulatory system has failed to protect us from.
Right. Incidentally, there are at least 2 excellent documentaries on just exactly that, in which they show the people who have been poisoned and how this spray is not confined to these fields, but drifts into other areas. And if it's near a school, the kids end up going to the hospital right there, and so on. It is really dangerous, but it took forever for this to get well, if it's regulated at all now, is that these cases ever came to the front, as you say there. Okay, now the another issue is that they use these genetically modified seeds, and there is a great deal of misunderstanding of what that involves. You wrote an excellent article, you've written more than one, on Mexico's fight to protect its own corn against the GM corn. Tell us, if you will, about the GM issue in general, and especially the patents and their the use of toxins, if you will, and then the Mexican case.
Yeah, I mean the rise of genetically modified crops, people don't realize how recent it was. It was really only in the early mid-90s that genetically modified crops began to be commonplace. They're commonplace in a set of what are called commodity crops, that these mass-produced crops like corn, soybeans, canola, cotton, a variety of other crops. Not all crops have genetically modified corn or genetically modified traits, but what they're modifying in general is they're inserting a gene from another species. That's why it's called genetic modification into, say, the corn plant. In the two things they do with these insertions, one will insert an insecticide that will kill the corn borer. And those are called BT. It's a naturally occurring. It's actually an organic compound that's used as a natural pesticide in very safe ways. But when you put it into the genome of the plant, the corn borer takes a bite of the plant and consumes the insecticide, and the insecticide actually destroys the insect's gut. It eats its way out from the stomach out and kills the pest that way. The argument has always been that it's safe, that it does not get into humans, that it does not cause any problems in humans, and new research is showing that that's not true, that there may well be a pathway we've seen a lot of rise of gut-related ailments in the United States, and that these things could be causing that. The great advantage of BT corn, though, as it's called, the insecticidal corn, is that you then don't need to use other pesticides to control for that pest. The other thing that they do is they insert a gene that confers tolerance to the application of Roundup herbicides, of the glyphosate herbicide developed by Monsanto. And it's called Roundup Ready crops, meaning that with the insertion of this gene, you can liberally spray all the herbicides you want on the plant itself, and it will kill all the weeds on the ground, but not kill the plant. Again, the advantage from a farm management perspective is obvious, like, oh, well, good, I don't have to go through my field and just spray my weeds. I can just douse the thing and my corn and soybeans will survive. The downside is that you're applying it on such a wide level, and it's become such a popular type of crop that it's overused. And when you overuse any pesticide or herbicide, you get resistance to it. And that is the other great problem that comes with this technology. The more widespread it is, the faster there's a resistance to it from weeds that manage to survive it and then reproduce and become super weeds, or pests that survive the insecticide. And the farmer finds they have to then start using more of another kind of chemical to control that problem.
Right. And then another issue is the patents with these GM seeds, and that takes us to the case, like a very good case with Mexico, for example. But could you tell us how those patents work from companies like Monsanto regarding the farmers, and then tell us about the Mexican situation struggle?
Sure. So these are, I mean, a new seed variety is patentable in the United States. You can patent, it was controversial when it happened, you can patent forms of life. And a new seed variety, even though the genetic material generally being used has been developed by farmers in their fields as they crossbreed and develop new varieties themselves and test those varieties and purify those varieties, select seeds for the best kind of corn they could possibly get off their land. That's a kind of genetic improvement too. They get no credit for that, and they certainly don't have any intellectual property rights over it. The Monsanto, though, when they develop a new seed variety and a genetically modified seed variety in particular, they have patent rights over that. And that allows them to charge a higher premium on the seed. It also allows them to not allow anyone else to use the seed without, if they didn't pay for the seeds in the first place. And that's led to litigation with Monsanto going after farmers saying, you stole our seed technology. And they use that very, very boldly to put farmers out of business and intimidate farmers into using their technologies. There's a very well-documented history of that. But one of the big things that I write about in the book, and that affects Africa and Mexico to a large extent, developing countries in a way it doesn't here, is that these kinds of seeds, hybrid seeds and genetically modified seeds, will not reproduce faithfully from the plant that you just grew. So the kernels of corn I just grew from these genetically modified seeds cannot be planted and reliably grow a high yield crop of corn. So people need to buy them every year. They need to buy seeds every year, and that's the magic of it for Monsanto. And if you package that with Roundup herbicides, then they're having to buy a lot of things from Monsanto and Bayer. They're buying seeds, they're buying the herbicide that goes with it, that the seed is intended to resist. They're buying pesticides, and they're buying other products. And so it's a very it leads to very monopolistic practices, which is what we've seen everywhere.
Right.
I mean, the Mexico case, what's so interesting and important about the Mexico case is that Mexico is the center of origin for corn. It's where it was first domesticated. It has behind me here, you see the 59 varieties of native corn that have developed over 6 millennia of farmers selecting and breeding and trying different crops, adapting them to their local environments. The United States and Monsanto and other seed companies started to pressure Mexico to allow them to grow genetically modified corn in Mexico, and Mexicans said, absolutely not. We will not, because corn pollinates on the wind blows the pollen can go miles away and pollinate a native variety of corn. And they're saying that we're calling that genetic pollution in Mexico, and we're not going to allow it. The new government in 2018 of Andres Manuel Lopez Obrador came in with very strong promises to the rural communities that he would limit genetically modified crops. And he took executive action to restrict the use of genetically modified corn and glyphosate in tortillas, not in animal feed, which is the vast majority of the corn we export to Mexico, in tortillas. Very tiny percentage, maybe 1% of what we export to Mexico goes into tortillas. So not a real serious impact on US farmers of taking that action. But he took it for precautionary reasons. Mexicans eat 10 times the corn we do in the United States. And they eat it in what we call minimally processed form. We eat corn. I mean, where do you eat corn? You're thinking of maybe sweet corn in the summer, but you're eating corn in high fructose corn syrup in processed foods, corn oil, soybean oil. You're not eating it like ground up and cooked. That's how Mexicans eat their corn. It's very nutritious because it's produced in that way. It's actually very impressive that it's produced in that way. They've developed that technology too. It's called nixtamalization, cooking it in lime, and it brings out a whole rich variety of nutrients, including proteins, so that it's Mexicans get about, on average, about 50% of their proteins just from their corn. Our corn doesn't give us any protein hardly. But the United States took Mexico to a trade tribunal. It filed a formal case under the trade agreement with Mexico that used to be called NAFTA. Now it's called the USMCA, the US-Mexico-Canada Agreement, arguing that Mexico was taking an action that violated, that impacted U.S. farmers' capacity to export corn to Mexico, and that it was a violation of the agreement. And for the last year, Mexico has been fighting that case in a tribunal, a three-person set of arbitrators will be determining whether Mexico violated the agreement or not. We've been providing a lot of support to Mexico's arguments that they weren't really impacting trade very much. They had every reason to take precautionary measures given the concerns about the high levels of consumption of glyphosate and genetically modified corn, and the threats to biodiversity, to the diversity of Mexico's rich variety of native seeds. And so that process is ongoing. There'll be a public hearing at the end of this month, and then it will go to the tribunal, and there'll be a decision in maybe October, November on the case. But Mexico just elected a new president, Claudia Sheinbaum, their first woman president in their history. And she's from the same party as the current president and has vowed to stay the course on those same practices. Really, it promises to continue to be a very hot button issue and a continued fight. But what's been most gratifying and impressive is the government's willingness to stand up to the big companies and make a case that your regulatory system is shabby, and you cannot possibly assure us that that in the ways we eat corn, that it is safe for us to consume your corn and with your herbicide residues. There's no evidence. And they're right, there's no evidence. So they've really been, I think, a beacon for all of us in the United States and around the world to document that, just what those risks are and how poorly regulated the U.S. industries have been in putting us at risk with these crops.
Yes, another thing, thank you so much for that case in Mexico. That's of interest, I think, because it is an example and for other countries. And if Mexico can do this and pull it off, then other countries are going to follow suit, and maybe even we will down the line, and get some justice in this. But thank you for that wonderful explanation of the Mexican corn and their very brave struggle to do this. This will be watched. I hope it will get more attention in the press as well. But thank you for your articles on this. We are about out of time now. I think we should transition to the questions, if that's all right. Do you have anything else that you'd like to add before we close out and go to the questions? Real quickly here, we have about a minute.
Yeah, I mean, I think the one thing that people in the United States should really pay attention to here, besides the science of risk, that I mean, the studies that Mexico's citing come from the United States, half of them. I mean, one of them is a study of farm workers in California, or farming communities in California, where they saw a really odd rise in the incidence of kidney and liver diseases among adolescents. And the pediatricians there were saying, what is going on? And they went to a pesticide monitoring group that has been taking urine samples from kids in the region, found many years of samples of some of these kids who were suffering these things, and they found glyphosate in their urine from very young ages. And so it's that kind of new evidence that should be a wake-up call to all of us. And if the United States government was being honest and straightforward about assessing risk, would say, okay, that's serious. We care about our adolescents and whether they get premature kidney and liver diseases, for goodness sakes. I mean, that's something to pay attention to. But instead, the US response has been nothing new here. This isn't a smoking gun. There's no proof that it's causing it. And Mexico's saying, we're talking about the precautionary principle here. We want evidence that it's safe before we're going to let our people eat it.
Right. Turn that around.
The other thing that's important, and I'll stop there so we can get to questions, is just that the opportunity for the United States, and I've argued this as an economist multiple times, the United States can grow non-genetically modified corn if it wants to export to Mexico. Mexico isn't saying we won't take your corn. They're saying we won't take your GM corn for tortillas. It's really easy to grow. We were the world leader in non-genetically modified corn before we were the world leader in genetically modified corn. You can do it. And there's a whole set of farmers who are ready and willing to switch over to non-GM corn, and they'd get a 5 to 10%, actually the last count was it could be as high as 20% premium price because it's a specialty crop, certified non-GM corn. They'd make more money. So this idea that US farmers are losing because Mexico has taken this action, it could actually be a direct benefit to them if they'd switch to non-GM crops and export to Mexico.
Well, thank you for that. That was wonderful information. I especially appreciate it because there's so very little out there in the media. We never get the straight story, and we really need it because it's damaging health and environment and climate and everything else. So thank you for that. And now I think we'll transition to the question. How do these restrictive state laws that protect big ag, how do they interfere with journalism and public health agencies?
Wow, that's a really good question. I mean, it's kind of, if the questioner may be reading the news very closely because it's all over the place. How our regulatory agencies and have been impacted by industry influence. There's just a story that came out today, I think, of the EPA. I mean, the way the journalist wrote it, it was a very good, very well-written story because she said, this should be a parody of a story, but it's not. It's a real story that the EPA just had to come to a labor agreement with its scientists that they could report their science without interference. And you think, but there were all these whistleblowers who came out and said, no, we've had supervisors changing what we've done. We've had all of this interference in we're scientists. We want the science. Beholden to anybody. We're beholden to what the evidence says. And that has been a constant refrain. I mean, one of the things that Mexico cites, and it has to be one of the things that really gnaws at the US government when they read it, is they say, one of the reasons you can't assure us that it's safe for us to eat these crops is because your regulatory system is corrupted by big ag money. It's not kept up to date. You have not kept up to date with the most recent science. You have declared the issue of health risks settled science, which serves the industry because it prevents any new evidence from entering the discussion. And so now to get a new GM variety approved, you don't have to show any health and safety information at all. And you haven't had to for a long time. All you have to show is that it's a lot like the last thing you approved. So it should be fine, right? And rubber stamp, no oversight. And so Mexico's called the U.S. out on that, on the conflicts of interest, on the lax science, on the out-of-date science. And I think that's it's a huge. I mean, I think the question was about the impact on journalism.
It has impacted journalism.
And it has certainly impacted journalism. The chilling effect on research and on journalism is severe. I mean, there was a protest letter sent by a set of academic researchers from agriculture universities that they wouldn't sign for fear of retribution, saying, we're not being given grants because we want to study organic agriculture. Like, our departments are afraid to ask for money because they're afraid the chemical companies will identify us as hostile to them. And the chemical companies fund a lot of the agricultural research at public universities now, another form of conflict of interest.
Okay, thank you. Why doesn't Mexico switch to organic corn? Do they have organic corn?
They have a lot of different kinds of corn in Mexico. There's parts of Mexico that look a little bit like Iowa in the sense they're large industrialized farms. They don't grow GM corn, and they do use pesticides and herbicides on that corn. Those tend to be hybrid varieties, not native corn varieties in Mexico, but still the majority of corn in Mexico is grown from native corn varieties. And those generally get much lower applications of fertilizers, of chemicals, than the large industrial farms do. That said, the question about organic is a really good one. Mexico has an entire program that they've piloted and scaled up in the present Mexican government's term, which is coming to an end, of promoting agroecological farming. And it's not a strict or narrow organic farming, although it gets there eventually. It's an attempt to farm with fewer chemicals, more bio inputs. Yeah. So they've invested a lot in developing biopesticides and bioherbicides that are less toxic and to the environment and to animals and to people.
Right. Just want to insert here. It seems to me that with these native seeds, especially the Mexican corn, which has this very, very long tradition, great variety, that they have more resistance to a lot of pests anyway. Is that true? So that they require a lot less of the pesticides and such, and that they also respond better to climate change many times.
That's right. I mean, it depends on the farm. It's hard to generalize too much about Mexico or even about a particular seed variety, because it's the seed variety, but it's the farm management.
Okay.
And what really makes a farm resilient is diverse cropping. So, and that you still find a lot in Mexico. You'll find, I don't know about where viewers got their schooling, but my kids were still being taught about the three sisters of Native American agriculture in when they went to school in Massachusetts. And the three sisters is the anglicized term for what Mexicans call the milpa. It's the growing in the same field of corn, beans, and squash, and they're all symbiotic crops that it's considered one of the most sustainable and nutritious crop mixes ever invented, because the crops themselves nourish the soil. So you don't have to either let the soil lie fallow to replenish. You can do that year after year after year. And the food that's produced is almost a complete diet just with those crops. In the typical Mexican farm, at least the more developed, diverse farms, they'll have as many as 14 crops, chiles and all kinds of different crops growing in the same field, and they all play a role. One of the effects of that of that kind of farming is that natural predators um, will go after local pests so that you don't need as much pesticides or you don't need any.
Mm-hmm.
And the same with weeds. You can keep down weeds by forms of ground cover that are actually your bean plants and your squash plants covering the ground and preventing weeds from growing. And so it's a much more holistic way. And I'll say that I saw some of the most beautiful and impressive such farms in Africa, in southern Africa, when I was researching my book. Just beautiful, sustainable, and low cost. And that's the other thing that we'll say about it. When you're doing all that, you're not purchasing inputs.
Right.
And so for poor farmers, that turns out to be absolutely key. One of the reasons you don't get any uptake on fertilizer use is because they can't afford it.
Right. That's a really good point. And just right on top of that, a question then is, why do these poorer nations accept big ag or green revolution plans that are heavily promoted by billionaires here, if it does so much damage to those farmers and their native seeds in these countries where what they're doing is fine?
Yeah, it's a complicated story, right? I mean, what a lot of African governments see is that they don't have a lot of money for investment. And so they do want to see more food grown, and they would like to see their farmers growing it and not be importing it, because it's also expensive to import food. If you have an agricultural country, if you have land, if you have farmers, you should try to grow your own food. But they bought the notion that this package of so-called green revolution technologies, the commercial seeds, commercial fertilizers, commercial pesticides, will increase the productivity of those farms. And my research has shown that it just hasn't in a meaningful way. But I think there's relentless pressure from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, from the Alliance for Green Revolution in Africa, from USAID, our development agency, on these governments to condition our aid to them on their acceptance of these kinds of technologies. We'll give you aid, but it's got to go for this. And I do think there's a real awakening going on in Africa about just how badly that's served them, how little it's produced more food, how little it's increased productivity, and how food insecurity keeps getting worse and worse when small farmers have alternative and better means of growing more food.
Okay, thank you. That's a very good point. And one more here is that, to close out, we have a problem in this country with this highly this overproduction of these monocrops, and they are less and less nutritional all the time, and so on. So this question is then, do you have any insights on how we can find healthier food in the United States besides the farmers markets? Can we change things in some way, I think?
Yeah, that's a very good question. We're in the belly of the beast here, the belly of the industrial agriculture beast, and it's change is very hard to come by, but there are a lot of valiant efforts, and where those efforts come together is around about every 5 or 6 years, we have a new farm bill. We're now negotiating a new farm bill. The Biden administration has put more money into what are called conservation programs within the Farm Bill. Some of those would be really helpful. Fully funding those would be really helpful. One of them, for example, will reward farmers for good land stewardship, and that can incentivize better practices, use of fewer pesticides, use of better water management, better soil erosion control, all of that kind of thing, incentives for farmers to do that. It also will take land and put it in conservation so that we're not just overproducing and overproducing, because the contradiction of this idea that everybody has to get big or get out and produce more and more and more and get higher yields, and is that we have too much most years. And what happens when you have too much of something? Supply exceeds demand and prices crash. And prices are now below what it costs to produce corn in the United States. And that's just so stupid to manage a system that in which the only way farmers can make a living is if you then bail them out with subsidies.
Yeah,
it's just like take some land out of production, put it into meat product, put it into grazed cattle, put it into conservation, put it into some other kind of use that stops this terrible cycle of overproduction, low prices. And then, of course, there's the other thing I've worked a lot on Mexico. You get this, when there's a surplus of a cheap crop, there's a real urge to find new uses, ways to get rid of it. Hence, ethanol in the United States, not the best climate solution for energy. Hence, massively cheap and increasing exports to developing countries. What does that do to Mexico? Super cheap corn comes in, crashes the prices for local corn, and farmers there have a lower incentive to grow more of their own corn. It's destructive on every level. And that is the flip side of this genetically modified corn fight in Mexico, is at the same time that the US is saying, no, you can't protect your consumers from eating GM corn and glyphosate, we're firing off more and more and more ultra cheap corn, while Mexico is on a whole food self-sufficiency campaign to try to increase the amount of food it grows itself. How do you do that when everything's coming in ultra cheap from the United States and you can't stop it because of your trade agreement? That's the big dilemma.
Right. You are a gold mine of information. I really appreciate this. I think people will learn a lot from your talk and from this book. I hope people will read this because it's very informative and very readable. And so, Timothy Wise, I thank you very much for joining us today, and please keep writing. You're a wonderful writer, and this is a very important topic. Thank you again, and goodbye.
Thank you so much.